working with Dan and Charlie, Dan Arnold and Charlie Halsey on who did the preface and afterwards, but I think really did a wonderful job doing it. I don't know how much I can answer or defend Steve's arguments, but I hope you would read the book and see what he had to say. And he had to say a lot, but I'll talk a little bit about that here. Kate mentioned, and I think it is right, that Steve and I had extremely different styles. And so doing this, I really wanted to keep not put Steve's ideas into my phrasing and my language, but there were so many parts of the book that were left undone, and so much that needed to be kind of further explained, and so that was difficult to sometimes write in his style, to fill in sentences even sometimes. And then Steve didn't leave any notes. He didn't leave any footnotes or anything like that. So tracking down all of these things, and his wife was very, very helpful in this, in going through his notes in his library, both as his home and his office in University of Chicago. And so I have big boxes of like handwritten notes that I went through. And then I went through a lot of the books he used and just saw where like notes were, stuck in the pages of the book, and that helped as well. And then and some things I couldn't track down. I think most things I could, but some things I couldn't. But let me read a little bit from the introduction, and talk about that editorial process, and then talk about my relationship with the book. Excuse me if I can't see anyone, so I don't know. So I can't read the room, so I don't know. I don't know how people are reacting. But please interrupt me if you can't understand anything, or you have a question about something. So I'll just read a few passages. It fills me with great sadness that he can't be here today introducing his last book. Speaking of Steve Collins, and Kate was right. It was 29 days. We received this book 29 days before he passed, so almost exactly a month. The task of editing this book is unsettling. I feel like I'm sitting in the stale repose at the end of a slow divorce. It's been both liberating and devastating. I fear that all attempts to provide Steve's last book with architecture and vocabulary will be a feat. What I most want to get across is that Steve, as he states in the second section of this book, was ultimately concerned with writing about ordinary Buddhists going about their business with care. Steve cared about people, and he deeply respected those who took deep care in how they conducted their lives. I wanted to care for his words and his intentions in this book. And as I believe he was he was a true gift to our time and to our field. I will attempt to explain my process and my choices below and in the endnotes. I won't talk about the endnotes today, but I could if you want to. Steve Collins was and will continue to be an unsettling force in my life. Surprisingly, we were not very personally close. I wish I knew more about Steve's favorite albums. Steve was a huge jazz fan, and he spoke to my son. I think actually my son, in some ways, my son just turned 17, was some ways closer to Steve than I was, so, because they really got along very well. And so Steve talked to my son a lot about jazz. I didn't know much about Steve's favorite philosophers or favorite foods. For God's sakes, I don't even know if he was a tea or coffee guy or a scotch or a bourbon guy, really. Claude, his wife, said that he was a gin and tonic guy. So I realize now how little I knew about his daily life. We talked about children a good amount. He wanted me to have 3. He was really upset that I didn't have 3. I only have 2 children. We talked about horse racing a lot. Both of our fathers liked to gamble a lot and were bet a lot on horses. But usually Steve and I's chit chat didn't last long. He wanted to get back to work and push me. Well, never my official advisor. He was like a thief in the attic of my mind, moving boxes around, rifling through old memories, looking for heirlooms, and uncovering thoughts long neglected. He made me think about things I wanted to avoid, whether they be my childhood or big questions about culture, gender, identity. He liked to stick to facts, the text, the field notes, and he pushed me into realms of. I like to stick to facts, fields, and text and field notes, but he pushed me into realms of reflection, interpretation, speculation, and theory. When I wanted to remain Irish and low to the ground, fingernails dirty with dark soil, only asking questions that started with how or what, he forced me to be a little bit more French, regard the macrocosm, to ask why, where to, what next. He was never my friend. I had friends. Friends agreed with me. Friends were impressed that I could pay my rent. Friends let me drink too much. He was that person you didn't want to see because he forced you to sober up and to take difficult concepts and uncomfortable emotions seriously. He provided me with a sense of urgency, a sense that writing, students, and books were to be treasured and taught. Steve was unsettling and unnerving to me because he was unpredictable. He threw me off balance with his biting criticism that seemed to be often unfair, but what I would later realize was totally right. He seemed at times to have the diligence born of desperation, and other times the effortless wisdom born of a life of quiet repose. He had the patience of a sage and the rash temperament of a teenager. There was no fixed hierarchy of his interest and no desire to make those around him comfortable. He was like a living koan with a smile that was both warm and ironic. I could never quite tell if he was laughing at me or with me. And anyone who knows Steve or knew him knew that he really was unpredictable, and that I think it was strange oftentimes. I think especially for his students at University of Chicago, or a couple of them told me. I have some good friends of my generation, like Thomas Borchard and Jay Carbine, and Alicia Turner, and really wonderful students that came out of the University of Chicago. That why did him and I collaborate, and why did we meet so often and travel in Thailand a good amount when I was never a student. I think the reason being, one, when we met, we were both big smokers and drinkers. I'm sitting in my home bar, and so you can see some things haven't changed. And I was a bartender for many years, and we were both I don't know if it's lower class, I guess. My parents never went to university or anything like that. My father's a truck driver, and Steve's family was not an academic family, and I think we got along that way very well. And we both felt uncomfortable in some ways in certain institutions. So in many ways, even though we didn't see eye to eye a lot in terms of our approach to scholarship and certainly our approach to writing, I never formally studied with him institutionally, we got along in other ways. And funny thing is, I was actually interviewed to study with Steve in 1998 when I was applying for PhD programs, and I gotten into the PhD program in Chicago, and I went to meet him because I met him once. When I was a master's student, he had come. I was studying at Harvard, and he came there, and he gave. Actually, he didn't give a talk. He was just there. I think I forget, meeting with friends, and I met him there. But then I later formally interviewed with him, and basically he was very dismissive of me, and he was basically said that, well, I don't think I could help you because I don't ever plan to go to Thailand, and I'm never going to study it. And then like 2 years later, he got a great interest in Thailand, started studying language, started traveling there. So it was like I just met him at the wrong time. I think I would have studied with him if his interest in Thailand was a couple of years earlier. But we ended up working and actually spending a good amount of time in Thailand later. So it was in a sense strange that I had this relationship with him, and I knew I got to know his wife pretty well, because we were, we really didn't see we just worked in such different ways. It's hard to explain. Like we just style of just almost everything was quite different. Um, and in our approach to Theravada Buddhism, but I really learned a lot from him. And I think he was this he never allowed me to go in a sense too far in one way in the field. I think he always reminded me that I needed uh, to see things from many different perspectives. Um, and so when I approached this book, when I took it on, I really, in some ways, I think it was good because I often disagreed with it, and it was a very humbling experience to me to allow always just to remember in every single step to allow his voice and his arguments to shine. And so I heavily in the introduction, like half the introduction is even his still because I just wanted to quote as much from him as possible from different parts of the books. And I'm going to read another passage now about that editing process. What I could gather from Steve's notes in the draft he sent was that he was struggling a bit with the structure of the book, but he was very confident about the content, especially emphasizing the importance of the comparative intellectual approaches to the problem of the self, which, as Kate says, like from his very original work in the late 70s. And then the first book in 1982, the problem of the self was the overarching problem that drove him in his scholarship. The book Wisdom as a Way of Life, which the title is changed now, even was changed from his original. I allowed myself a heavy hand with the structure of the book. I reduced 3 chapters to 2 larger sections, but I had a very light hand in the tone and the language of the book. I wanted Steve's unique and often acerbic wit and style to be fully present. Steve and I are stylistically very different writers, and over the years he was often quite critical of my overly American and very colloquial and very familiar approach to writing. He was a proponent of less is more and wrote in a very precise and deliberate way. He was fond of quoting Pascal's famous line, "I've only made this letter longer because I have not had the time to make it shorter." I, on the other hand, am quite a different writer. I'm a fan of the architect Robert Venturi's motto, "Less is a bore." However, here I defer to my mentor. Not only did Steve want to write a short and direct book about ideas, but he also insisted that there be no footnotes to clutter the argument and distract the reader. He would have added scholar's citations, I believe, and an endnotes and a bibliography, which none of these things were present in the draft. But of course, he died so suddenly. Therefore, I had to add the references for the sake of scholarly accuracy and integrity. Therefore, there are endnotes to avoid clutter, but to ensure the reader can check the primary and secondary sources. I also noted in all the endnotes where I made editorial choices, I was really direct and upfront about this. I tried to keep those to an absolute minimum. I largely excised the first chapter and the 2 sections he originally entitled Preliminary Comments and Preface. However, I did this because many of the topics he brought up were repeated in the second and third chapters. Steve, if you know him, you would know that he hated repetition for emphasis. He believed that scholars should trust their readers and write things clearly once. If he had a chance to edit his own first draft, I believe he would have removed these repetitions that I did. As for the content in the first chapter, the preface and preliminary comments are not repeated later. I used the introduction to talk about them. The main content of the book has 2 main positive, even revolutionary contributions to the field of Buddhist studies. I say positive because it also has a few highly critical comments and very negative comments about the field that were voiced in a negative tone. They are not the main arguments, but I will discuss them I just discussed in the introduction and in the endnotes. On the positive side, Steve was largely organizing his thoughts around what I see as Gantadora, the burden of books, and Vipassanadora, the burden of introspection, distinctions in the study of Theravada Buddhism. Steve did not classify them in this way in the book, but he and I had conversations about this topic, and I surmised that he might have organized the book loosely in this way. We had this very specific conversation about this a few years ago, and he really kind of liked to think about it in this way. Basically, Gantadora is book learning. It means that a person can approach the study of Buddhism, the study of text and commentaries, listen to homilies, studying the teachers directly, and the like. They can also should approach through through meditation, practice of rituals, performing acts of empathy and compassion, contemplating ethical conundrums, and caring for the lonely, the poor, and the sick. There's sometimes an inaccurate understanding a person can choose one over the other. However, traditionally, each practitioner should focus on both. The two major sections of the book, Steve was trying to articulate why Theravada mattered to the much larger questions in the study of Buddhism and religion more broadly. He argued that humanities needed a Buddhist perspective on how to learn narrative wisdom and how to act through asceticism. He saw Theravada Buddhism as providing thousands of examples from texts and practices that promoted the idea of active and engaged learning for students of philosophy and history, as well as social and ethical actors. Steve didn't value Theravada Buddhist knowledge over knowledge coming from any other religious tradition or wisdom tradition, but he did argue that it had a unique perspective that should be part of humanistic studies. Humanistic studies was more than just studying about the intellectual, social, and cultural history for the sake of knowing more. It should be also about making you reflect about the nature of a life well lived for yourself and for others. Interesting, because of this and because of the editing of this book, I'm actually teaching a course in the spring. Hopefully it'll be in person. Because of COVID, it's the fall classes are online. Called Happiness and Despair, and I'm co-teaching it with a philosopher, and so looking at kind of eudaimonics or living a life well lived, and so I focus on the value of sadness and self-destruction and kind of morbid thoughts in art and literature and religion, and philosophers talking about well-being and mindfulness and things like that. And then I teach another course I've taught for about 5 years called Existential Despair, which takes place 4 to midnight one day a week. It's an 8-hour long class, and we sit in a room and contemplate these things. And so I really take this concept very, very seriously of practice and humanistic studies together, which would attract me to Steve's book and Steve's approach. Steve, getting back to the introduction, Steve himself struggled with being a struggle between being an historian and a philosopher, an archivist versus an instructor, a linguist in the library and a wordsmith in the classroom, a preserver of the past and a guide for the future. This book was a struggle with his role as a scholar of Buddhism and his role as a teacher and father and mentor. He was uncomfortable with himself, and he provided a wonderful example to his students that personal, emotional, intellectual struggle meant that a person cared deeply for what they did, and they cared deeply for others. Specifically use this distinction between engaged textual study and engaged practice to structure this book, titling one chapter Wisdom and the other chapter Practices of the Self. And I'm just going to summarize them quickly, and then I'll open it up for questions. So here's the first kind of major section of his book. Steve's first section is called Wisdom, and he said wisdom was largely about the study of Theravada text and how students should approach the study. It includes topics such as narrative literature, focused primarily on the Jataka stories in Pali, versus systematic literature, direct instructions on the way of being wise, the importance of comedy and romance in Pali literature, and why there are so many animal stories in Pali. It is, I believe, the single best guide to how to read Pali literature for students and scholars that I've encountered, and will become the kind of go-to book for my students from this point forward. Steve so succinctly writes in this first section, and I'm quoting Steve here, as a collection, the Jatakas give voice to, and indeed I would go so far as to say they celebrate the diversity and complexity of everyday life and its values, end quote. And it explores the way in which this practice of the self actually works in textual study, expression, and performance. His 1998 magnum opus, Nirvana and Other Buddhist Felicities, in that book, he first mentioned what he saw as 2 ways of Theravada Buddhism to express themselves in text, through narrative and through didactic systematization. In this book, he fully explains what he means. He was dismayed by the way scholars and students often separated the study of systematic explanation of the workings of the mind, the elements of the universe, and the process of time found in text, like the Abhidhamma, and its commentaries, how that was separated from the study of narrative literature found in Jataka's stories, many of the suttas and commentaries in the Dhammapada. He insisted that they be studied in tandem, as long as one understood their differences in style, purpose, and performance. And then I go on to describe this chapter on wisdom a little bit more. Steve said that the very idea of the person who cultivated wisdom in Buddhism as possessing systematic knowledge and emotional intelligence through reading, listening, and reflection on narrative, that a wise person had a capacity of judging rightly in the matters relating to life and conduct, soundness of judgment, and the choice of means and ends, sometimes less strictly sound sense, and sometimes with more practically. Steve wanted this distinction not to be merely definitional, but as an invitation to teachers to present Buddhist primary sources in a new and dynamic way, not to exercise narrative in favor of systematic teachings, nor to see narrative as merely popular entertaining literature. Here's that both were essential to comprehending the way Buddhists came to understand their own textual heritage. So that's the kind of summary of this chapter called Wisdom. And in the second major or section, these are really long chapters, by the way, so I should say section. Second section is called Practices of the Self. Is an expansive and almost lyrical reflection on why Theravada approaches to meditation, asceticism, and physical training is such an important contribution to the modern condition. I argued, in the thing that a lot of, this is a struggle, I think, probably a lot of people who teach Theravada Buddhism, and a lot of people, I don't know who's listening to this, but students and teachers of Buddhism, we struggle a lot to teach about the religion or to learn from the religion, right? And as Charlie Hallis, you might say, and that we don't want to, we would be less serious scholars if we brought meditation into the classroom, or we brought kind of reflections on texts and our own personal experience into the classroom, that somehow, in a sense, gets rid of our our objective stance as scholars. And Steve struggled with this, and I certainly do, but Steve was not, new agey. He was not in any way, if you know him, and he wasn't he didn't like this kind of commercialized trends of mindfulness and new age approaches to daily life. And he was, as I write in the introduction, he was subdued in his dress. I joked with Kate that I would be wearing an all black shirt today, because that's Steve always wear all black button down shirts. And he always wore black pants. He was subdued in his in many ways in his style. And but despite, however, as I write, despite not falling for spiritual obsessions or self-help fads, Steve firmly believed that Theravada Buddhists had something important to offer intellectually to the project that modern historians and philosophers, like specifically looks at Michel Foucault and Derek Parfit and Pierre Hadot. And so he looks at their projects and he compares them to what Theravada Buddhists were saying in this section of the book. He saw these Western philosophers as attempting to articulate what Theravada Buddhists had been arguing for over 2 millennia, that the study of philosophy and ethics were largely practices of the self, and being such had to involve both textual study and aesthetic lifestyle. This is why Steve was particularly interested in writers and scholars like Max Weber and Leo Tolstoy, who voluntarily adopted aesthetic practices in eating, celibacy, and silent contemplation into their own lives. He often liked to compare Benedictine, Franciscan, Augustinian, and other Catholic groups, monastic groups in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East to Buddhists in South and Southeast Asia. And his book collection really largely reflected that, how much he spent time studying history of Catholic monasticism. So those are the 2 large sections, and I just want to make a couple more comments about meditation, how he studied meditation in the book, and then I'll open it for questions. Steve didn't study meditation or ascetic practices in a narrow sense, or separate those practices from textual study, philosophical or existential reflection, or everyday learning of manners and etiquette. Indeed, what he learned from Foucault and Hadot especially was that the practices of self fit very well with what Theravada Buddhist project entailed. And I want to end off by quoting Steve entirely here. And I quote, The phrase exercises and practice of the self could be taken very widely indeed, so widely they become useless as an instrument of comparison. Those of my readers, this is Steve speaking, who have had children or have seen younger siblings grow up will know that all parents and obviously all societies have to teach children everything. In Foucault's terms, they have to be taught how to behave in any and every domain, how to walk, eat, deal with waste matter, speak, in what languages, how to dress, how to interact with others, etc. The entire process of acculturation, in this sense, in all societies, all civilizations, and all cultures, is this cultivation of a certain kind of self, a certain kind of subject of experience and action, restricted to each community's mores. One might say acculturation is a universal necessity, but there is no universal culture. Selves are always constructed in specific times and places and in specific ways. The results differ widely, but the process is the same. The learning of specific forms of physical and mental self-control, the ascesis, from the childhood on, and the introduction of culturally specific ideas is part of what constitutes sanity in any given social context. The introjection and performance of certain basic components of human sociality, so-called morality, can be seen as a kind of wisdom promulgated at length in the Buddhist text. It is helpful in this context to remember that the French word sage, when used of children, can mean both wise and well-behaved, and the formation of which refers to both school and university education, creating a certain type of subjectivity. And then finally, he writes, or finally, I'll quote what he writes here: a slightly less general, less comparison, useless form of self-construction exists in more specific vocations, each of which has its own construction of physical and mental subjectivity, its own ascesis. Examples are his training in many different arts and crafts, and the production and capacity to appreciate high-status literature, in athletics and sports, and military training, and alchemy and magic, all of which require one formation, a training which procures a certain type of individual who possesses certain skills and certain mental and physical skills which others do not. One might say that vocational training produces certain kinds of skills achieved by certain kinds of person. I think one rather should say skills produce the persons. And these are not simply referring not simply or not at all to the mere acquisition of knowledge or skills, but to the transformation of the individual's entire persona, internal and external, a change in subjectivity in the subject of knowledge, and we're not merely in the domain of knowledge which the knowing subject knows. Very steep way of saying something. This transformational process, Foucault calls spirituality. And in his and Hegau's view, ancient philosophers were led ideally by means of such exercises to what they saw a discovery of universal truth. And so you can see in Steve's tone and his approach that he really was being very bold in this book, and that he really saw that we needed to see the study of Theravada Buddhism not only as essential to the humanities, as I said, but also in a sense as a part of creating ourselves, and that our studies create ourselves, and that we cannot separate that from our textual studies and our reflections from the way that we lead our lives and we discipline our bodies, and practice music and walk and meditate and eat, and all of these things were deeply connected, and that when we teach Theravada Buddhism, we have to teach it, in a sense, not as a set of texts and set of statements, but a different way of living life, and seeing life not as something that means something, but as a process of meaning making. And I'm going to leave it at that because I went a little over time, as I always do. And I'll open it up for questions here. Again, I can't see anyone. So I don't know who will be asking questions. So if you can state your name, that would help. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for your talk, Justin. It was really interesting to learn a bit more about Steve's character and how that impacted his work. If people have questions, they can press the hand icon on their screen, or if they prefer, they can write the question in the chat and I can read it out. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand.
Oh, Naomi, Angela, I know them.
So should we have the first question from Naomi?
Oh, thank you. Great honor. Hi, Justin. It's lovely to see you.
Hi.
Hope you're keeping well.
Oh, I see you now. Oh, video.
You can see me?
Hi. Yeah, hi.
Sorry about the messy background. We're doing DIY. So I read this draft. I actually waited a year after Steve had died before I read it because it felt a bit too soon, and I was really interested in this process of editing, and I just want to congratulate you on having completed it, because it must have been a really, really difficult job, but really worthwhile. And I just have a really specific question, actually, which is about the title, because that's changed quite dramatically, and I just wondered what your thought process was around that. Obviously, I know that titles are often decided as much by publishers as they are by authors, but I'd love to hear what went into that.
The very first endnote is all about this, so I will read it directly. I changed the original title of this book to reflect a reduction of 3 main sections to 2. Steve's original title was Civilization, Wisdom, Practice, and Practices of the Self, Theravada Buddhism Seen anew. I chose a new title of Books and Selves to reflect the 2 sections that remain, since I wanted to keep a title that fit with Steve's title. I went with Of Books and Self, since one of Steve's earliest published articles on asceticism and practices of self was a critical review of 3 books on asceticism that he titled Of Death and Trees. I wanted to keep Steve's style and encourage readers to look back at Steve's larger work. And that article was originally published in 1998. However, Steve's family and Dan Arnold urged me to reconsider the second title, and we settled with the help of Wendy Lochner. So, as Naomi says, publishers certainly have a lot to say about this, of Columbia University Press, and they wanted to change the titles to fit Steve's appreciation of Hadot's work, and so they picked Wisdom as a way of life, and so that's how that came about. And so what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do, and then what Dan and Wendy wanted to do was really trying to see what would Steve pick that would fit more with, because it was a tripartite title was his, and so since that one part wasn't there, a lot of that part is actually in the introduction, and I quote in the book, so it is there, the content is there. I will also say that Naomi was the single most cited scholar in the endnotes. Your 2 books in Jonica were like so many. I think at least 30 of the endnotes are you. So you are a huge part of this book, actually.
I hope not all critical.
I had to reread a lot of your work in order to see, because Steve he would draw from you, but he didn't fully flesh out like the page numbers or anything like that, and so.
And I was really sad not to have the chance to have a conversation with him about that chapter in particular, which I had a lot to say. To have those conversations would have been a real joy. But thank you. Yeah.
No, it's great. No, it's a good question.
Anthony Scott, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Professor McDaniel, thank you very much. Tony from the University of Toronto, currently in Tokyo. I wanted to ask, so I appreciate learning about Steve's life, and I think that's really important to know about a scholar's life. You made a couple points about how Theravada studies can have this transformative potential and reinvigorating the humanities, and that I think does get at the question of isolating textual studies from other kind of studies, whether meditation or what have you. And I was hoping you would talk a little bit more about how morality was kind of working in his system, because just from what little I heard, it seems like, you have wisdom here and meditation's over here, but it didn't seem like there was a real kind of basis in talking about morality in the classroom, whether we should teach meditation in the classroom or not, that's a discussion. But I've never really heard the idea of the kind of didactic teaching that Theravada could offer to reinvigorate the humanities as well. A little bit of a naughty question. I'm sorry for asking, but I was hoping
it's a good question. I don't know, in a sense, what Steve would define as morality versus, kind of a general ethics. But in terms, he would probably use, in terms of morality, he would say, aesthetic discipline. So having a consistency, or not necessarily consistency, because he often wasn't consistent, but an awareness of what you do, and how you speak, how you treat others, how you eat, how you drink, how you, raise children, or, conduct yourself at work. And for him, it wasn't a sense, for him personally, wasn't a sense that there was a moral code that he was following. And he certainly, he wasn't incredibly religious himself, either Catholic or Buddhist. And so it wasn't a particular moral system that he was drawing upon, but this idea that there's a phrase we often talked about, would be loosely translated out of Lao, would be wherever your awareness is, that's where your morals are created. And so basically, like a person who is aware of how they eat or drink or talk or move or walk or anything, that creates a moral code, that the awareness actually creates the moral code. You don't apply a moral code because that's kind of blind following something. Is that a good nun or a good monk or a good layperson that's practicing this over time, in a sense, their awareness leads them to the Vinaya, like they would naturally follow those precepts if they were aware. And so the precepts then are, in a sense, there for people who have not built up that awareness yet, that sati yet, that they need this. And that teaches them at the end, they figured out, oh, well, now I don't need somebody telling me to recite the 227 precepts twice a month, because I just live them now. Because just by observing others and observing myself and interactions, this is what I would do. I would act more selflessly. And so the baseline is not a moral code. The baseline is awareness that should lead to selflessness. And so this idea of practices of the self, in a sense, is practices of the creating the non, or realization of the non-self, if that makes any sense. But yeah, anybody would meet Steve, the last thing you would think is that he taught Buddhism. You know what I mean? Like, it's he didn't seem very pious. He had no beads. He had no, like, you know what I mean? Like, and there's nothing wrong with any of that either. But like, he seemed an unlikely character for it. But he also would seem an unlikely character for somebody studying Catholic monasticism too, perhaps. Great, I think it's great. Yeah.
Thank you. Angela, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks, Olivia. Thank you very much, Justin.
Hi, Angela.
Hi, how are you? So good to see you. Thank you so much for waking up at 5 a.m.
Oh.
Well, waking up before 5 a.m. actually. My question is about the concept of the self that are discussed in the book. It sounds like Steve's main focus is on certain European and American authors, and then comparing that with canonical, I'm assuming, or almost canonical texts of Theravada. Are Asian philosophers included in this? And also, how did Steve deal with the kind of time imbalance between all these people? On the one hand, you've got the body of changing approaches to Theravada texts, and then you've also got the differences in perception over time of how we perceive some of these European and American ideas of the self that were written by these specific philosophers. If this makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. No, absolutely. I have to say, this is like when I said I would never. Steve and I had such different approaches. I would never write a book like this. Anybody who's read anything I've written, I would know. I don't probably never quoted a Western philosopher in a book on Buddhism, and I don't generally bring in concepts or theories to articulate Buddhist thoughts, and Steve did. And the time issue I'll get to in a second, which well, the simple answer to that, Steve did not care. There was not his social historical context of where ideas developed was not his concern in this book at all. But what he did was he thought the problem with the study of the self in European context was that it was very Eurocentric and very limited, and this idea that Foucault and Hadot would, they drew from Socrates. Well, in Hadot's case, Socrates was, his main focus of his career in Neoplatonism as well, is that a study of the history of Western philosophy as a history of the practice of the self. And Foucault, in the same way, is drawing on the Catholic tradition. Foucault did very badly cite some Buddhist texts, which Steve criticizes. And so that he felt that there was that Buddhism, that the Western discussion of practice itself needed Buddhism, meaning that you couldn't just have little quotes here randomly selected. It needed a serious engagement with, and you said, is there, Buddhist philosophers or Asian philosophers, and it's a Buddha Gosha, who Steve, in a sense, the committee of Buddha Gosha, whether it's one person or not, and looks at Buddhist texts and wants to put them in a direct conversation with Western approaches to the practice of the self, largely through the Catholic monastic tradition. And so he wanted, in a sense, Buddhists to have I think I even say this in the introduction point, he wanted Buddhists to have a seat at the kind of philosophy table and an equal seat. And have a vibrant discussion of the practice of the self. And then he felt that what happens largely in the West is that people, in a sense, when they pick up Buddhist texts or study Buddhist texts, they look because they want to study Buddhism, right? Where he said you should, if you have a philosophical question, is that you should be picking up a Buddhist text and a Sufi text and a Catholic text, Jewish text. So, you should be picking up important world literature, important pieces of philosophy written at different places in time by different ethnic groups and nationalities and in different languages and all of these things, is that this needed to be part of a humanistic education, and to limit Buddhist studies to the study of Buddhism in Asia and not to see it as, in a sense, the study of simply wisdom in general, or practices of the self in general, was not was not a full education, and that you couldn't be. And this book, and I think, is largely written for scholars, not of necessarily Theravada Buddhism, as I think it's written for scholars of the humanities or students of the humanities, is that a humanistic education in any context is incomplete without the study of Theravada Buddhism seriously, just as the study of Theravada Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy is incomplete without the study of philosophies from other places. And so that was very much the case. And in terms of time, he just believed that a world of ideas of a person reading now is that there's a world like wisdom literature, and that should be part of a child's education and an adult's education at any time. Context, is important, and if we're going to study something, we have to know the context and we have to know the languages and things like that. But that just as reading a poem from the 8th century or a poem written 2 years ago, they're both good poetry, and so and you can learn from them. So I hope that helps. But yeah, I struggle with this myself, just because I don't approach Buddhist studies this way. But I learned a lot too.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the question.
Are there any other questions? Anybody can feel free to raise their hand or put the question in the chat. Kate? I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. You may hear lots of building work. I have no roof above me. Justin told me to get a roof over my head, so I'm going to try and do that, but I haven't managed to. Thanks. Justin, thank you so much. Really, really interesting talk, both about the content and the process and about your engagement with each other. You mentioned early on, apologies for the banging, you mentioned early on about this being, in a way, an extension of his early work, this, you know, the technology of the self and changing self. And I wondered if you thought there were also departures in this work. You know, he said it was going to be his final work. He was planning to move on to look at European cultural history, I think, and philosophical history. Yeah, so were there any departures, any surprises?
That's a really good question, because I never thought about it that way. I mean, yeah, in some ways, you found parts of his book in all of his other work, like in his work on time that never really was fully fleshed out early on, is found in here. He was writing, I think you know this as well as I do, he was thinking of writing an entire book on time, monastic time in Buddhism. And that was, he spent a year in Thailand, like going to a monastery and looking at like annual rituals and things like that to figure out how time worked. And he abandoned that project, but I think a lot of that showed up in this. So that's new. I think certainly he talked about Foucault a lot throughout his life. And then I went back and I'm like, well, he must have written a lot about this, but he actually didn't, like in his previous publications. I think he just had talked about it so often that I felt that I read it. And so that was really culminated here. He had given so many talks, as you know, over the last 10 years of his life, where parts of this book were in it, that this was a long, slow process. But when he came to writing it, a lot of times he quoted from Nirvana and other Buddhist felicities, and then in that shorter Nirvana book he did later, he quoted a lot from his book on female monastics, French book he did about 5 years ago. A lot of that notes, when I found his notes, were drawn from that research. And then some parts of Selfless Persons that I think were kind of unpolished and that were showed up in here a bit. So yeah, this was a, you know, I kind of like to call this book like a slow burn. You know what I mean? Like this took a long time to come out. And when I read it for the first time, I felt like I read it before. Like I felt like, oh geez, well, yeah, this and that and this and that. But I think it's because I'd heard him speak so many times on it and then I kept going back to old books to find, and he really wasn't directly quoting his older work very much, but certainly threads of it were apparent everywhere. I certainly think Foucault is new. That most of that is new. And then a lot of his stuff, which did not get into the book, but I quoted a lot in the introduction from the Buddhist civilization, or how to study Buddhist civilizationally, is stuff that he talked about a lot, but is not present and really formally in a lot of the previous work is there. And then the whole section on the Buddha Gosha's fantasy is stuff he had talked about many times but hadn't written down. That's certainly new. And then his sections on the religious studies industry, as he called it, were new, which I still think were unformulated when he died. Like that's why I think that section of the book, he certainly was not ready for publication. So I really struggled with putting that in. So yeah, so you can tell I'm thinking on the fly because I never actually thought of that question before, but yeah, I had to reread so much of his stuff, which was a pleasure, to make sure I was, citing things correctly. But yeah.
It's amazing how much you put into this. It's really extraordinary.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's fun work. I mean, it's really, so it's and yeah, it's like it's about the best thing you can think about. You know what I mean? So, it's like listening to old albums. Like if somebody says like, it was a better way to spend a rainy afternoon than listening to like your favorite album from like 17 years ago, right? It's like reading this article that you read when you were a graduate student of his, and like it just, I don't know, it filled me with delight a lot. So.
Brilliant. I hope you can stay on for a bit in case there are any more questions. I'm just going to make a couple of announcements if that's all right. So next week's talk is Sangha Tilakaratna, who has been working recently on a new project with the International Committee of the Red Cross, with Andrew Bartlett-Smith of the Red Cross, on the interface between international humanitarian law, that's the law that applies during war, and Buddhism. So I hope people will be able to join us then for Sangha's talk. This talk will be recorded, is being recorded, and will go up on the website in a while. So that's sort of the end of our hour, but hopefully Justin will stay for some more talks. And Justin, I'm just going to sneakily put in another question there, which is what are you working on yourself at the moment, having generously spoken about Steve's work all this time?
I just finished a book actually yesterday. I mean, I have to edit it, but I just finished the last page of a book yesterday on manuscripts, on a collection of manuscripts, Siamese manuscripts from 1770 is the oldest one to about 1910. So looking at about 44 manuscripts and about 12 which I like kind of really do full studies on. So that's a very textual work in art, I guess, because it's a lot of images, illuminated manuscripts. And then
who's that coming out?
That'll be probably through the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And then I have a collection of articles coming out with Kyoto and NUS presses that'll come out. That's in process. That'll be out soon, I guess. And I think it's yeah. So, but yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's and then little other things.
You also get so much done, and it's always such fascinating reading.
Well, I've just been translating for 2 years, basically, is what I've been doing. Just always translating, and that's like the funnest work. In some ways, I find it the most satisfying. So.
If I hand back to Olivia in a moment for any remaining questions, people who want to leave, if you could just, when you do, just maybe put your video back on and give Justin a wave. I just wanted to say a little bit more about Steve, actually. So, his interest in studying Theravada civilizationally is kind of interesting, and culturally. So I think one of the things we perhaps share, Justin, Steve and I, is the Irish background, and I think that is there in our cultures. So that kind of influences certain choices we make and certain choices we fail to make, maybe. But I think Steve was hugely self-critical as well about his life. So, there was a practice, a strong practice there. So he undertook very difficult things in order to change things that he felt were harmful for others. And I thought that was really, really impressive. So there was this huge integrity. And the way he promoted junior scholars was very interesting. He contacted me, and I'm sure he contacted Naomi and others a few years before he died, asking for bibliographers and stuff, because he wanted to teach a course with only female authors. Yeah. So before this current move to decolonialize the curriculum, he was already thinking along those lines and took a particular take on depatriarchizing the curriculum, we might say. Anyway, so I'll hand back to Justin and Olivia for any more questions. But as you leave, people, do just let Justin know who his audience was by showing your video and giving him a wave if you leave.